Welcome to Defy These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century. It is a project born out of my conviction that doing so requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to understanding our complex world. I'm your host Joey Ayub, and in these episodes I bring you conversations at the intersection of politics, history, philosophy, culture, science, and all the fun stuff in between. The following episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check the website for other methods. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabeat. Here's the episode. So this is a conversation with Phoebe Wagner. She's the co-editor of the 2017 book Sunvault, Stories of Solarpunk and Eco-Speculation. As you may know by now, I've been sort of promoting this movement, or at least as a framework, called Solarpunk. So I had Phoebe Wagner on because I felt like she was one of the best people to talk about this. So of course we asked the question, what is Solarpunk? And alongside that question, we asked, and what is wrong with modern storytelling about the future? We discussed the flaws in many ways of modern storytelling, from the patriarchal tropes and the importance of moving beyond them to kind of broader questions around the crisis of imagination. We highlighted the value of community building in stories and in the real world. And we also discussed a kind of more philosophical question, maybe like, is knowledge power? And we tried to answer that in the context of Solarpunk. So this may at times feel a bit too niche. I hope not. I mean, the entire point of an episode like this one is to kind of bring about a topic that is up until now relatively niche, but to a wider audience. So it really matters to me what you think. Please let me know by email or on Patreon. And yeah, that's it from me, folks. Thank you for listening and take care.
My name is Phoebe Wagner, and my pronouns are she, her. I currently am a settler on Susquehannock land in so-called Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and I'm a writer, editor, and academic.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot for having this chat with me. You've co-edited this book. You know, that's how I got to reading some of your stuff. And this book is called Sunvault, Stories of Solarpunk and Eco-Speculation, and came out in 2017. So let's kind of start from the beginning. What is Solarpunk to you? Then I'll kind of say what's Solarpunk to me, and how did this book come about?
Yeah, and thanks so much for having me, Joey. I'm excited to just be talking about Solarpunk. One of the things I think that's unique about Solarpunk is that everyone, as it becomes more popular and more people try to define it, I feel like everyone has a different definition of what Solarpunk is. So yeah. I'm curious to see if our definitions will match up at all or not. And I actually think that's really great. I'm sure some people think there should be a general definition of Solarpunk, but to me, that means everyone's taking what they need from it and adapting it to what their community needs or their individual needs, which I think is perfect and what it should be. But yeah, so Solarpunk to me is a genre of literature, but it's also a way of thinking and viewing the world, and also like a lifestyle choice. Though primarily a lot of people still see it as literature, which I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But one of the things I would love for Solarpunk to continue to do is grow beyond the page and become something that we can use practically. But yeah, my vision for Solarpunk kind of has three parts. So I see Solarpunk literature as a way to imagine new futures in the shadow of and in opposition to environmental collapse. And then the Solarpunk literature works to create those futures on the page. I think Solarpunk stories must recognize the climate crisis and environmental collapse as entangled issues that include all oppressive systems. And then finally, that there is no environmental justice without racial or decolonial justice. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about Solarpunk right now. And should I go on with how this book came about, or?
Yeah. Tell us how, and then I'll just,
All right, cool. Yeah. So for the book, Bronte, my co-editor, Bronte Whelan, and we were both in an MFA program together for creative writing and environment. And we were just starting to think that we wanted to do some sort of project together, and sort of settled on an anthology. And the reason we chose Solarpunk is we were frustrated with a lot of the sort of dystopian stories that we were seeing. Not that dystopia stories are bad, but there was definitely, particularly in 2015 when we started putting the proposal for the project together, there was like a lot of dystopias that were coming out right around that time period. And so we were kind of in reaction to that. I came across Solarpunk on Tumblr, where a lot of people came across it, and was really struck by the fact that it was recognized the impending and like happening aspects of climate change, and that things were like bad. But at the same time, it didn't just go into dystopia. It was like more, it leaned in the hopeful direction and tried to say, hey, how do we reimagine this world as surviving and thriving during climate change rather than devolving into a dystopia. And I was also struck by the fact that it did include social justice issues. So it wasn't just environmental, which is something that environmental literature, I think, often struggles with. And then also that it made room for not only science and technology, but also spirituality and spiritual practice, which I think is really important, particularly when we start to move away from Western ways of viewing the world, which do obviously come with a harmful, very often harmful Christian religion, not always, but often. And then when we start to look at indigenous practice, spirituality is so important to that. So we can't just, get rid of all spirituality. Like that's not helpful either. So were some things that really drew me to Solarpunk. And then Bronte and I were really interested in helping to try and jumpstart one of the, quote unquote punk genres. And we put the proposal together and things just kind of fell together from there. And I am just like really pleased to see that the book is still being read and that it does seem to still be impacting people, which is the most you could possibly want, is that someone would still be reading the book, years down the line. So yeah, that's kind of how it came to be.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I genuinely, I haven't finished it. I'm reading basically like different stories at a time. And for me, Solarpunk is kind of just like something that I've been searching that I didn't actually know, I didn't have a name for in some ways. I read a lot of books, a lot of fantasy, a lot of sci-fi, and I do enjoy them, even like the dystopian and all of that stuff. There are some pretty good ones. But it, as you said, like it always felt like there was just something really missing. And same for movies, especially with movies, I suppose, because that's kind of the imagery that we keep in mind. And at some point, I just got really, really tired of the genre being kind of the go-to of anything that's set in the future. Like almost anything set in the future is basically bad. Like it's basically not just bad. I mean, because things might be bad. Like the reality or the possibility that the future might be bad in itself isn't the problem. Obviously, I don't want people to kind of conflate Solarpunk with just being naive and kind of hoping for the best and not kind of thinking of things through. But because, as you said, like a significant component of it is actually recognizing the dangers and the ongoing, the happening, and the forthcoming, potentially forthcoming dangers of climate change. And Solarpunk started for me also like mostly just like an aesthetic thing, just visual stuff. And it's pretty recent, like it's just in the past few months, and really past year or so, in my case. And it was like Tumblr, Reddit, some just mostly like pictures of like the nice architecture and picture of like gardening in certain urban spaces. And sometimes I didn't know what the difference between Solarpunk and just like really cool permaculture would be. There was this kind of vagueness to it in the beginning. But then the more I kind of got into it, and obviously that's where the literary aspect came in, at least in my case, it's when I started saying, well, now I can look at Solarpunk as one way, it's not the only way, but like one way of thinking about climate change. And it's really the very act of thinking about climate change. I just took a course. It was like Think We Must, and that at my university. It was really about the difficulties of thinking about climate change, like this literal act of thinking about climate change. And Solarpunk allowed me to kind of do that a bit more. And so yeah, that's kind of like my kind of my two pieces on that in the book. So I don't know if you can, by the way, feel free to kind of talk about specific stories if you want,
Mm-hmm.
but I'll mostly focus on like the theme in general.
Mm-hmm.
In the intro of the book, you mentioned, I have the quote here, like the way we believe in the future is intrinsic to the fabric of our storytelling, end quote. Okay, so you mentioned it a bit, but kind of let's flesh it out a bit more. Like, what's been wrong with storytelling, broadly speaking? That's kind of a huge umbrella here, about the future so far, in your view.
Yeah, and that's such a great question to think about the future of storytelling, because that's what I've been really wrestling with this a lot. And I'm going to root this very much in like the US production of like storytelling and literature, because that's what I'm most familiar with. But I think one of the problems when we're thinking about storytelling for the future is that here in the US, much of the broad, widely available storytelling about the future is written and created by white men with a focus on the global north, rooted in this idea of progress, that capitalism is the way to go, and that we're going to keep moving forward as the quote unquote human species, and we'll solve climate change and we'll solve all this stuff somehow. And so I think that's just been so much of who has controlled our storytelling for quite a while here in the US. And that's what's broadly available to the population. Now, obviously, there's like whole literary movements that push against this. Like there's definitely a lot of diversity in what's available, and we're definitely seeing a big change in what's available right now as just more storytellers are having access to like publication and to platforms that aren't monitored by like, big corporations, whether it's podcasting or like web shows, things like that. So there's definitely like different things, but like a lot of what when we're thinking about like what storytelling is like widely available as thinking about the future, I go back to the Marvel Cinematic Universe a lot, just because here in the US, like I enjoy the movies, as probably many people do, but especially in the US, like a huge portion of our population at this point has seen at least one Marvel film. And what's interesting is a lot of times in the future, these stories are talking about climate change. They're referencing them in some way. So that's what a portion of the general population has access to. But at the same time, if you watch like Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which is one of the new shows, like definitely shows that like propaganda about the global north is alive and well and being shown broadly. So in general, whether it's storytelling about the future or the past, I personally believe we need to start moving away more from the individual hero and protagonist and the singular journey with the rising climax and falling resolution, for like lots of reasons. Obviously, that's a very like westernized storytelling method that really supports capitalism, supports like the current sort of mode of thought, supports patriarchy, et cetera. So it's like rooted in some of these like oppressive systems that Solarpunk literature is hopefully actively pushing against. But then too, I think there's no satisfying ending to the climate crisis right now. Like there's no satisfying resolution in sight in the way that our storytelling wants us to have a satisfying resolution. So then suddenly we have to start rethinking, how are we going to do narrative? How are we going to do storytelling? And then with that question, of course, comes as well, like, is it going to be traditionally published or traditionally made into a movie, or is it going to be disseminated in a different way? So I think sort of thinking about that is that we need to start thinking about storytelling and decoupling it from these harmful systems. And first, I think just acknowledging that storytelling is like a tool of nationalism and has been. And once we start to acknowledge that, and we can start pulling it away from those systems and think, how can we use it to break down these systems rather than support them? So that's kind of what I've been thinking about when we're thinking about storytelling about the future. And how we can sort of start to move away from ideas of progress, especially. I think about that with science fiction a lot, because so often we have progressed, we have left the planet, human species has gone to war multiple times, but sometimes we're at peace now, and sometimes we're still fighting, but we have all this technology, and like there's still this idea that the progress is just going to keep going and going. And that's something that I would really like to see examined in a different light, because I think it is harmful at this point. We need to start owning up to that as writers if we include that in our fiction.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the earliest movies I think anyway, it's one of the earliest in terms of like climate change related disaster movies, like that The Day After Tomorrow one. I was thinking about it recently, and it kind of fits a pretty general pattern in a lot of similar movies. Like bad things happen, but kind of humanity comes together, although lots of people are going to die. That's too bad. And then towards the end, there's kind of like a resolution of some kind. Like I think in The Day After Tomorrow, I mean, spoiler, sorry. But like, it's not a good movie, guys. Don't listen to it.
It's also very old. I don't think you can do spoilers for it anymore.
It's fine. But like, the president comes and says like, we've learned the lessons of Mother Nature's wrath or what have you. And essentially the idea is that, climate change is going to punish us for about a week. And then we'll get over it. We'll learn from our lessons, and we won't do bad things to the environment anymore. Like that's kind of the general pattern. And I see this in a lot of, even you mentioned the Marvel Cinematic Universe. For me, like Thanos as a character is fascinating because I feel like he exemplifies a lot of the current anxieties, let's say, about our world. And some people would actually say that he's not really the bad guy, even. That I've heard the actor himself, whatever his name is, he said so. But anyway, but Thanos is someone that you can beat. You can murder. You can just kill him. That's it, and then problem solved. And
Exactly.
you can just do this thing, and you undo it. You get these Infinity Stones. You just click, and that's it. Problem solved. And even with that, you will have, of course, the hero arc in the end. I mean, spoilers, I guess. Whatever. But for me, that is something that is. Like it just got tiring. I really got tired. I have watched most of these films. I would still from time to time go. I definitely don't think there's something inherently bad doing so, but there's something like impoverishing about them at some point. Like I guess it's also like how many movies you watch or how many books of such you watch. You read, sorry. So I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I needed to find something that would help me navigate different anxieties about the future, while at the same time knowing that these are works of fiction, right? Like these are not. I'm not reading a book and that says that in 50 or 100 years things are slightly better or what have you, and thinking that this is what's going to happen. But it's one way of at least trying to put myself in potentially better scenarios in the future, with the intention or with the purpose that this then helps me in the present do something about it, if you see what I mean.
Oh, for sure. And that's one reason why I think of, like, I was thinking of Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents books while you're talking about that, just because they are dystopias. They're generally considered dystopias. But at the same time, they give you all those tools. Like Butler has a section where she, like, basically, if you're reading it with that mindset, she teaches you how to pack your own bug out bag. And it's just like amazing, like, to do that in a piece of fiction and not feel like it's like expository and should have been cut, but it's like an important part of the book, and to give these survival tips while still telling an engaging story that's still like this dystopia that's also like still scary to read. And it's just like finding that balancing act is, like, one, I think, just difficult from the point of view of a writer, but then also two, it's just like when it's done well, it's like so helpful. Here's, like, I could go to this book and like pull things out that are like actually useful to read and like useful to my thinking about climate change, and even potentially useful to my survival in a bad situation.
No, for sure. And yeah, okay. Just to go back to kind of the dystopians in general as a genre, right? You just mentioned, you just gave an example of how they could also be good things. It's not inherently a bad genre, bad plot. But why, in your view anyway, why do you think this dystopian post-apocalyptic genre, these movies especially, why do you think they've been popular in recent, give or take, few years or even past couple of decades, to be honest?
Yeah, I've asked this question of myself a lot, and I don't really have a satisfying answer yet. I mean, there's definitely plenty of like academic writers and like public intellectuals too that are thinking about this. Like Frederick Jameson's Archaeologies of the Future is a book that that talks about utopias and dystopias. I think it's like really useful if someone wants to start digging into that. I think for me, I feel like it must be something to the effect that we want to know what the worst thing that could happen would be, and what that and we like, and knowing that somehow satisfies something within us. And but at the same time, like, I like find especially climate dystopias very difficult to read. Like, I don't go to them anymore, because I just like I like can't I have to I think about it. I think about the climate crisis a lot just for my PhD, my dissertation that I'm working on, articles that I'm working on, plus just thinking about Solarpunk and stuff. So like, I can't go read a dystopia for fun. Like, that's not where I go when I want to sit down and read a book that something enjoyable. But I also think, like, playing out the worst of what could possibly happen, whether it's the climate crisis or it's a natural disaster or it's social collapse. I think that's one reason why we need Solarpunk, because we're not seeing. It's interesting that we saw a rise in dystopias, but not a rise in utopias, because they're, different sides of the same coin, right? But we're only seeing the rise in dystopia. So what I worry about is that we're like self-prophesying or like manifesting these worst case scenarios, rather than thinking about, hey, let's acknowledge that things are bad, that, things are going to get bad, and they are bad, particularly depending on where you live and your class and things like that. Um, but that it's let's acknowledge this horror, but then let's do something about it. Let's not just like play out the worst case scenario. Let's figure out, hey, what is an alternate scenario where maybe things, don't get so bad that we can like actually act and like make a difference in. I think also dystopias, and you've already kind of mentioned this, they really feed into our like lone hero obsession too, particularly in Western literature. And I think that's another reason why they fit very much in. Not only do they feed on our worst case scenario desire, but then also it's like, oh, here's someone that can fix it. Here's like usually a white man that can go and fix things. And so I think that also just feeds into the type of stories that we're telling right now, which is another reason we're seeing like a lot of them. And right now, though, I feel like it's maybe gone back a little bit in the past year or two. We're seeing a few less, but I know, especially in 2015, I just remember there's like a lot of them. Though interestingly enough, like I did read 2 dystopias recently that I think maybe show there's maybe going to be a little bit of a shift in dystopian storytelling, which I was interested in. It was Moon of the Crusted Snow by Waubgeshig and A Children's Bible by Lydia Millette. And they both basically have the same premise, like, but they're from 2 very different communities, like the characters. So that's basically like what happens when the grid goes down. But in both these novels, while they're very dystopic and definitely have these very like fearful and horrifying moments, they end on these ideas of hope, and they also have a lot of action. Like the characters are not just trying to survive the dystopia, they're like actively trying to create a community that can like thrive and help other people through the time. So it's not quite the same thing we saw in like the Mad Max movies. So that was something I was interested in, particularly that ends on some hope. So I'm just curious to see how dystopias, particularly ones that are rooted in climate, start to maybe shifting or maybe not. Who knows?
I'm very interested in you mentioned the whole like lone kind of like the lone wolf actor, lone like hero, because when we watch these movies, like anything from like I Am Legend to I don't know whatever, all of these other films, we don't see ourselves as the people dying. We see ourselves as the hero usually. Like that's or as there's no point watching the movie. Like you won't resonate with the character, or at least that's a big part of why they end up being popular. And I think like the harm, and I've started seeing this. I can't prove it. It's not something that I just can't prove it, but I do think it's contributed to general sense among many like family members, some friends, some people I know, even some people I read, that like they don't necessarily personally believe that they will be the ones dying in those movies. If you kind of follow my thought here,
Mhm.
and this is sort of and I don't want my answer to that to be, well, no, you can die. Like, I don't want that to be my answer,
Yeah.
like, because I know that that's not helpful, because you have all of these, survival instincts that kick in, and becomes more of like an emotional conversation. And we kind of lose the plot of what we're trying to argue for. But I do think so the way I'm describing it, I'm writing this essay. I think it should be out by the time this episode's out. I'm not sure. For Mongol Media. And one way I've tried to kind of argue for Solarpunk, essentially, it's kind of like my own, like, this is why I'm arguing for Solarpunk, is that in the same way as it is very easy for like children in many places around the world to just imagine a zombie apocalypse, it's just super easy to do so. It's just everywhere around you. You don't need to even watch a movie. You just know about them just from hearsay and stuff, even maybe at kindergarten, whatever. I want it to be just as easy to think about Solarpunk futures, if you see what I mean. And because then at least there's some kind of like, they have a different set of tools at their disposal. And I mean, you mentioned Octavia, but I'm reading her book Kindred, by the way, now, which is
That's a great book.
I haven't read the Parables yet. I will soon. It's been recommended like I think 12 times on this podcast alone.
I'm sure, yeah.
But and Adrienne Mary Brown, I mean, she has like a podcast on Octavia Butler's Parables. But anyway, I know that there are many people like Butler, like Brown, like others, that have been trying to kind of think of like different futures that are also like actionable in the present, essentially, right? Would you say like, okay, this may be a muddled question, if that's okay, but I know that you mentioned like Solarpunk doesn't have a coherent definition. Everyone can see things, differently, and that's obviously fine. But would one of those, if there were kind of like a coherent definition, be that we're thinking about the future, knowing that we're doing something in the present, right? Like because there are books about the future like that. That would be the main thing that differentiates Solarpunk in my view. But I don't. That's just me.
Yeah, and I think that's really, I think that is an important part of Solarpunk, and maybe in a way that differentiates it from other environmental literature, is exactly that. Like one of the ways that Bronte Whelan and I sort of have formulated Solarpunk and sort of our sort of like call to action almost throughout a lot of our Solarpunk writing is this idea of hope through action. So this idea that the hope is the writing the stories of the future, right? That's some of that hope. But then the action is what we're doing today to try and bring that future to pass, or to make it viable, or to just make sure that the next generation of like humans and non-humans have like a place to like not just survive, but hopefully like thrive, like have a place that's going to be a good place, not what we're kind of setting ourselves up for right now. So yeah, that's kind of sort of how I think of it too, is that it does have that duality to it, but our actions in the present that are hopefully inspired from our stories of the future is that's kind of what's motivating us to try and do better here, even though of course, and maybe we'll get into this later, like individual action is not going to solve the climate crisis. Like at this point, I don't think anything's going to solve the climate crisis. I don't think there's a way to solve it. But it's definitely not individual action. So that's something that needs to be wrestled with as well. But still, there are things that you can do to change your relationship with the living world. And like any step forward in that direction, I think is always a positive thing that will impact the future, whether it seems small, like so small it wouldn't or not.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, just because you mentioned this now, you and Bronte Whelan have this upcoming book, I think,
Mhm.
Almanac for the Anthropocene. And this is a quote, like, it's a book to engage with Solarpunk on a practical level. So that's fantastic. What does that, I mean, what can you tell us about it? What does that kind of look like in some ways?
Yeah, so hopefully, we still don't have quite a release date yet, but I think it's going to be coming out within the next year for sure. But yeah, it's another collection of work. This time it is coming out from an academic press, so that is like sort of one of the bigger differences, and it's nonfiction. It's not necessarily leaning on fiction this time, in hopes of pushing Solarpunk to kind of move itself off the page and into like the living, or the unwritten world, or however you want to put it. So yeah, what we were working towards and what it is ultimately a collection of essays that encourage how we can take Solarpunk thinking and apply it to problems of today, or problems that we're facing right now in the moment. So like at the end of the book, in our last section, we have 4 different like blueprints or recipes, we call them different things, that kind of help people start to engage in small actions. So like whether it's like, we have a really great essay on foraging, and like it explains how to do it in a way that was really interesting. But we also have an essay on like how to mend your clothes, because that's something that, particularly as a millennial, like I didn't really know how to do. So just things like that is trying to pass this knowledge down to whoever would find it useful. But then we also have some larger philosophical pieces that are thinking about how we can take sort of like environmental thinking and apply it like right now. Like how can we do this? Like we have one essay that's titled a garden shed. Oh man, I'm not gonna remember. It's like tools in a garden shed for Solarpunk Futures, something to that effect. And it just kind of gives you different ways of thinking about the world. So yeah, that's kind of how we're trying to do it, and we'll just see. I'm really interested to see how the book is received, because I think it's like it is difficult to make that leap from fiction to reality. But at the same time, I think that's something as storytellers that, one, people have done in the past. This is nothing new. But then two, just putting value in literature as a way to help us think forward through it. And you mentioned Adrienne Marie Brown, and of course, one of the things I always go back to is her point that we're in an imagination battle. And that's one of the things that I think Solarpunk can be really useful for, but then it can also start to move towards inspiration for the now. In a way that Adrienne Marie Brown, of course, her work with Octavia Butler does that very much, wanting to take it off, not only have it on the page as inspiration, but then take it off the page as to something that is useful in the moment.
One way that I kind of think Solarpunk can really benefit from essentially is kind of playing with words a lot. And I know that there's a video by St. Andrew, who YouTuber, previous guest on this podcast. That's episode 68 for those listening. And it's a book. It's a word called perma blitzing, and it's a contraction of permaculture, obviously, and Blitz, which is the German word for like lightning. And obviously, most people in Europe, I suppose, when they think of Blitz, they think of the Blitz, which is when the Nazis bombed the UK. But obviously, the idea here is to actually use a term that was used for death and actually use it for life. And so, perma-blitzing, I have one of the definitions here. Quote: typically create or develop a community or household edible, wildlife-friendly garden according to a permaculture design. Perma-blitzes can also involve sustainable non-food growing projects. So it's not just food growing projects. End quote. And Saint Andrew there's an excellent video. I'll link it in the description. Kind of just explaining. It can be anything from just learning things, like dedicating a specific time and space to learn about different, either anything from like first aid to like geology to mycology to what have you. And the idea is really the driving force behind it in some ways is to emphasize speed and urgency in some ways, like to recognize that we are like we do need to do things a bit faster as well, or at least certain things, while at the same time doing it together. Like there is the community building aspect to it, obviously, because people can learn on their own. It's fine to learn. I tend to learn on my own as well. But obviously, in addition to that, it would be good to also have something that's more community oriented. And this kind of goes back in some ways to, we were talking about, like, again, this whole lone wolf thing. One thing that some of the better, in my view, like dystopian, or at least stories that are set in a dystopian future, like some of those, the better ones, something that they do is focus on how like a community comes together to do something. Well, often it's to kill off the zombies and to do something, that has an immediate resolution, because that's, more fun to shoot, I suppose. But the impulse is, for me at least, better than just the lone wolf who will live off his life. And because one thing that I found very fascinating, that a lot of those lone wolf stories, and maybe I'm focusing on this a bit too much, but it is kind of a pretty common trope. Often the life that they lead can be more interesting than your life. Like, the world is dead, things are miserable, but like interesting things are happening. And if you're watching this for an hour and a half or 2 hours or what have you, you can come out of that movie not being as afraid of that dystopian apocalypse in some ways as maybe you should, if you see what I mean. Or at least should work to avoid it.
Well, yeah, and something that strikes me from how you just described that too, and thinking about, I hadn't heard of permablitzing. I'll definitely have to look that up, because I think that's an important area that Solarpunk needs to move into, is taking what you know and sharing it, and like sharing it with the community. But that's something that I think about too with the lone wolf figure in dystopias, but also like there's definitely that figure in environmental literature as well, like whether it's like the tracker or the hunter. And in both these situations, almost always they have the knowledge to survive. And almost always someone comes along that doesn't have the knowledge to survive that ends up tagging along with this character in some form or fashion, right? And that's like that's part of that lone wolf trope, because it wouldn't be any fun to watch a single person go through a landscape. We gotta have two people minimum. So that's something I'm thinking about too, is that when we have that lone wolf figure, they're not sharing their knowledge with the community. Like their knowledge is all like situated inside of them. And that's something actually that like Wendellberry talks about too, is how we have this older generation of people that do have a different relationship with the land, just because of their time period being so different, when like, plastics weren't as readily available, just things like that. And how like that knowledge is soon going to be all lost, just as the population ages. And so thinking about how we can take that knowledge and share it, whether it's the person who does have a lot of like that lone wolf figure that has that knowledge, or whether it's an individual who might have found themselves in a community that doesn't have something that they might find common knowledge. And that's something that, kind of going back to the idea of permablitzing, that I hope that's we talked about in the book and really emphasized in the book. That I think Solarpunk, people who are interested in Solarpunk literature, identify as Solarpunk, something that they can really do is either get that knowledge if they have access to it, like taking first aid classes, I think was a great example. That's something that's been on my to-do list for like a while now, because that's something that knowledge that needs to be readily available and be able to be shared.
Yeah.
So doing that, or if they have something like at the end of the book in the conclusion, rather than sort of summing up our thoughts, what we did was we explained how to go about making your own anthology or collection, and sort of the steps to do that, because that's one way to disseminate knowledge. And that was a piece of knowledge we felt we could share in hopes of more people disseminating that knowledge and more people making anthologies or collections that will help spread knowledge throughout the community. So yeah, I think that's a really important thing, is taking your individual knowledge and plugging it into a community, whether it's an online community or even more preferably, of course, the physical community that you're in. If that's like a safe space for you to be a part of, like that's going to be your survival community if something does go bad, you know? So that was just, so yeah, just kind of thinking about that and thinking about how we can move from that lone wolf figure that has the knowledge to a community that has the knowledge. And what does that mean? And what does that look like?
Right, and also like I didn't mention this, but I feel, I mean, I think studies have borne this out by now, but like there is a perception that's usually widespread that when things go bad, um, people don't come together. And we've seen a lot, like from the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina to a lot of even like recently, you know, there are tools that people use to just come together. They may call it mutual aid, they may not call it mutual, like they may not have that kind of vocabulary, and it doesn't really matter. For me, Solarpunk contributes to kind of weakening that dystopian instinct, if that makes sense. Because a lot of, and here I'm sort of using a term that I forgot who spoke about it, but you know, the entire figure of like Homo economicus, of being basically, you know, usually a male figure, but you know, they don't always say this out loud, but you know, a rational actor who can just make decisions, etc., etc. It's obviously always an individual. It's not part of he usually it's a he. Is not part of kind of a wider community. Whereas what we see time and time again, and again, I'm happy to find those links and put them in the description for listeners. Communities actually do much better. Like community resiliency is so much more efficient even than individual resiliency, as you said. Like in most of those movies, if the lone wolf spent some time with his magic knowledge or special knowledge to just educate some people or just share that knowledge with like 5 other people, 10 other people, well, maybe you won't need a lone wolf in that plot, if you see what I mean. But yeah, sorry, I just wanted to add that.
Well, and I've been thinking about that pretty recently too, in a slightly different way. Almost always in those stories too, like the men with guns, that's what I call it in my head, the men with guns, like show up at some point. And I'm just like, I've just been thinking like, one, that doesn't happen, we haven't seen that happen in the way that it's depicted. Like usually the men with guns that show up is the government, and like in like a bad way. It's not just people from your community that had guns that suddenly band together and show up. Like that's not who's showing up with the guns. And so like I just wonder like as storytellers, like why do we keep including that in our storytelling when I don't think that's I hope that that's not going to happen, and I don't think it would to the degree that we oftentimes include it. And so I'm just like, that's just something I've been thinking about too, is that trope, and like why do we include it? Where is that fear coming from? And like what's put that fear in our storytelling, and like why should we continue that? Why can't we move away from that trope? Because like regardless of whether it would happen or not, it just doesn't seem like that's a helpful trope to keep continuing, you know.
So this is really random, but I've been thinking about something similar recently, because I had this conversation with a Bosnian academic called Ida Hozic, and she sort of analyzed how a lot of what we call, and this is more like in the like international politics world, how a lot of the what we usually call international relations, or like a lot of political science, kind of rests on the assumption that violence only equals this one thing. And men with guns, she actually used that same term as well. And that basically a resolution to a quote-unquote conflict basically simply means that the men have stopped shooting one another. That's effectively what it means. Even if the structures, like obviously I'm from Lebanon, and the what we call post-war, it resembles a lot of the actual war, because the same men eventually are in power. And I won't get too much into it because I go into this in the other episodes. But my point is that the sort of the framework of men with guns, let's just use that term, that sentence now, is pretty widespread beyond. I mean, you're in the US, so you know even this more than I do, but it's pretty widespread beyond just even a trope in media, or a trope in literature, and trope in like the arts in general. It's even kind of seeped into our international governmental models, if you see what I mean. A lot of even, okay, I'm not gonna get too much into this. I don't get too much into off the rails here, but it's something that I feel Solarpunk actually, and here this is pretty, you know, kind of like, this is just me thinking out loud. It's kind of in draft mode. But Solarpunk can even benefit in many ways thinking differently about things that like even international relations, things like even like diplomacy and all of those terms, because they usually also follow a pretty rigid one way of doing things most of the time. That has been changing recently, although not yet in the sense that it can make much of a difference on the ground. But there are lots of people, including like Ida Hosic, as I mentioned, that have been thinking about this. Like she literally analyzes how ethnic peacekeeping or peace sharing agreements are highly patriarchal structures. Because the ethnicities are usually male dominated, etc., etc. Anyway, so like just to say, kind of to kind of complement what you're saying, that even this whole trope, which kind of like is a patriarchal approach, is translated throughout our world, like in multiple fields, from economics to politics to what have you. And it's definitely something that I feel Solarpunk can contribute to in one way, maybe not the only thing, but in one way to challenging that narrative. If that makes,
Oh,
I
for
hope
sure.
I
And like,
hope that makes sense. Yeah.
oh yeah, it definitely does. And I mean, like that's just the hope, is that that's something that I noticed when we did Sunvault, when we were reading the submissions, is that we would have loved for a story to come in that challenged that. Like that would have been our absolute joy to have something like that. And I think sometimes Solarpunk, I don't know if it's or at least, and this I think is changing. I don't think this is where Solarpunk is right now. But when we were working on that collection, especially, it was a very like food oriented in a way. Like there was a lot of garden stories, which there's nothing wrong with writing a garden story. But at the same time, I was like, we're beyond this. Like we got to be thinking differently in a larger way. I think we have at least one garden story, like what I term the garden story, like that's focusing on how do we get food for a situation, and like something has gone wrong with our food production in our community. How do we solve it? Which I think just speaks to the fact that that's something that people are a little bit more knowledgeable about. I have a feeling that's where that comes from. And in the US, of course, we have a national literature that's based in thinking about like food, like growing food in the West and like growing food throughout drought. And so that's very much part of our national literature. So like, I think that's one of the reasons certain stories were coming to us. But yeah, that's something that I hope that Solarpunk continues to go in that direction, to like get to think bigger and to think through some of these dominating storytelling structures, in addition to thinking about on the small community level, whether it's a garden or a water source or a protest or something like that, like thinking on that small scale, but also on the large scale. So yeah, I really hope that that there's a writer out there that will write that story.
No, for sure. In one way, also to complement what you were just saying, it just for me it re-emphasizes that our dominant, for lack of a better term, I kind of struggle always to define the vague ideologies that we deal with. I mean, obviously capitalism, none of that. That they are also ideologies, like to actually name them as such, and because once you give them a name, then you kind of get. You mentioned Frederick Jameson. I mean, the whole like it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
Yep.
It's one way of actually making it easier to imagine the end of capitalism than the end of the
Exactly.
world. And this is one way for me that I'm still, as I said, kind of in draft mode. I would hope that the more kind of we push these conversations happen, the more like people listening to this. One thing that I will always try and emphasize, like I literally mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, that I got into Solarpunk like a few months ago. And this is the second or third episodes on Solarpunk, and I'm reading all of these books, and it's very easy to get into. You don't have to know anything. Just Google it. Play with the term. Go on YouTube. Do what have you. I've watched a lot of YouTube videos of people saying what they think Solarpunk is. Sometimes I feel like, well, it's a bit of that, maybe a bit more, and I feel like, oh, you could have taken this a bit further, But basically, what I'm saying is that listeners can easily just get into it. There's no, it's pretty vague on purpose in some sense. Another sort of difficulty that I've been having, and this may not be directly related to what we're talking about, I just want to kind of put it out there. A lot of the attention economy that we live in today, social media and the likes, it relies on very quick sort of, feedback loops and so on, all of those buzzwords now. I think most people know about. I'll try and do an episode on this specific, on its own, at some point. And for me, Solarpunk allows me to also get out of that in some ways. I have, it's not an anti-internet statement here. I've only discovered Solarpunk through the internet in the first place. And I'm not inherently anti-technology, but I do think some kind of skepticism is obviously warranted. And Solarpunk allows me to sort of find the balance between those two. Like, in which cases would it make sense to develop this kind of technology? In which cases would it make sense to just not? And like, it just doesn't make sense to do so. And I suppose my difficulty with talking about Solarpunk, at least for now, it's something that I'm basically just thinking about out loud as well now, is when I enter that term, like I literally go on social media and I write Solarpunk and I want to tweet about it or share or write or what have you. A lot of the time sorry, this is gonna be a bit of a vague thought, but a lot of the time I worry that it doesn't necessarily lead to just more people hearing about it. Or sorry, that it doesn't necessarily lead to more people actually then kind of logging off, so to speak, and then reading a book or a blog post or just checking it out or what have you. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that Solarpunk is also it's coming out of like from the internet in a specific attention economy world that we live in right now. And I do wonder what would it take, and I suppose a book like yours is basically the answer. So to get it off just those very quick feedback loops, if that makes sense. I'm sorry, I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it totally does, and that's something too that I don't know. When we originally kind of found the Solarpunk term, it did excite me because I think when you hear it, it kind of like there's like an intuitive sense that it makes. Like you're like, ah, yes, I have a sense of what this will be about just from hearing the word.
And
And I think
it sounds really nice. It just sounds cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it does. It just sounds good in a way that I think like cyberpunk actually also has that sort of like, ooh, like I know what that is just from hearing it, but it also sounds really cool. So yeah, I think Solarpunk has that sense to it, which I think is good in the sense of getting people to get that initial reaction. And then and like hopefully, like as you said, Google it or look in their local library to see if like now there's a couple anthologies out that are getting more distribution, or order something from their bookstore, etc. So I hope that is enough. But at the same time, like I think this gets to a bigger maybe issue that you kind of touched on, which is like, is a book or a story enough to really to like is knowledge power? Like that was something that you mentioned earlier. Like is like I think a lot of us, whether we were academics or writers or just readers, really believe that and want it to be true, that if we get the right knowledge, that will help us become better people and make a better world. And something that I think about is, and something that like I worry about too, is that because I am first and foremost like a fiction writer, I really believe that there's power for a book to change the world, like a story to change the world. But as we see excellent climate change fiction come out, we see excellent storytellers warning us, and they've been warning us for decades, for in some cases a century, that like the Industrial Revolution is going to play out badly. And the fact that we haven't made the change that we needed to make in order to be in a different situation than we are right now, and there's not enough change on the horizon to suggest that things aren't going to get bad in the next 50 years. And so that really makes me question the power of storytelling in the mode that it's presented now, which is, a best-selling book would be how we'd think of a story really being disseminated, or a movie that, makes $1 billion. And so sometimes I wonder, like, is as a writer, like maybe that's not the way that we're going to make a story that's going to change the world. Like maybe that's not how it's going to get disseminated. And what does that even mean? Like, does changing our community, is that the world we should be focusing on, the smaller community that we're a part of? Because if you wrote a book that changed the world, every community is different, and what they're going to need during the climate crisis is going to be different too. So there's not going to be a singular answer. There can't be a singular book anymore that's going to help like all the communities in the world. And I wonder how much that goes back to this idea that, we're going to solve the climate crisis, or we're going to like solve like houselessness or hunger, etc. Which of course just then spirals all the way back to our Western ideas of thinking, trying to create a system that will solve all the world's ills. And like, that's obviously not going to happen. So yeah, I guess I kind of spun out from where your question started, but just thinking about what I guess like how we're taught to view stories and how we're taught to view success, and also like what kind of story is like needed right now. Excuse me, maybe the power of story is not on the world scale, but on a much smaller community scale. And what does that mean for us as storytellers or content creators or creators in general?
No, for sure. And I mean that is definitely a difficult one. I tend to like storytelling is part of it's part of the story. Like it's part of the tools that we have at our disposal. Obviously, it's not going to solve social justice issues. Obviously, it's just part of tools that are there. The way I kind of try and think about it is that it's a much needed it's like it complements the work of climate scientists, for example. You know, like
Hmm.
climate scientists are doing more than most of us can do. It's a pretty difficult life already, and I know a lot of climate scientists that are, you know, already dealing with a lot of mental health issues due to what they know. Um, and I guess for me, I just think storytelling would be one way of approaching that otherwise pretty vague problem, at least for most people, a pretty vague problem. At the same time, I also think that language in itself, so I mentioned permablitzing, and you know, one thing that I know that has become more common in the past year with the pandemic is, you know, mutual aid. Mutual aid as a term has just become a bit more common. I just heard people that I know are not like anarchists or whatever, they just
Hmm.
have been using that term a bit more. And I do think it's one of the ways that we can hack a culture, hacking in the original nicer term definition than some of the current definitions. But anyway, a way of just influencing or like
Hmm.
inserting a certain way of viewing things by actually influencing language, which would then influence how we think about things. And that's, if we can find a way, in my view, if we can find a way to make terms like mutual aid, solarpunk, permablitzing, you know, all of those things just more common, just like it stops becoming this novelty, right? To many people, it's just something that's part of our vocabulary. Then maybe when things do happen, when there's something bad, or when there's a certain event that might otherwise just be kind of relegated to, oh, this is too complicated for us to think about, then we at least will have like these extra tools at our disposal to try and make, like, it may not always work, but to try and make some better sense out of it, if that makes sense.
Oh, for sure. And that's something like as a solar punk I've been thinking about too, is like, is the power of language. And I think it can go the reverse way too. So there's definitely words that I think we need to inject into our vocabulary that will, I think, help like just make people stop and think differently. Like slow violence by Rob Nixon. Like that term is something that I think is such a powerful phrase because it makes sense when you start thinking about climate change. Particularly, I think if you've lived through a climate event, like you know the violence doesn't stop after like the news cameras stop. Like it makes the sense to it that I think can help us rethink, like think through the world. But I think too, it goes the other way too about removing language, like words from our language, and thinking about the certain words that particularly colonizers have injected into a language. I'm thinking particularly in English. And so like ableist language is one that I think is everyone can start to work on just getting rid of. And it takes a lot of thought, and you do have to reprogram your brain because we say a lot of these words just haphazardly. But once you start to reprogram your brain, like that has a lot of like that has an extension of how you think about your community. Like, you know, if you're not using derogatory language. But then also there's this excellent essay by Robin Wall Kimmerer called Learning the Grammar of Animacy. And it talks about, it basically gives you a sense of how to see how language helps you see the world differently, and see the like the living world as alive. So like some of it is just about sort of what we think of as non-human and human. That's part of the essay, but it goes a lot more, it goes a lot deeper than that. And I always recommend people read that essay because it's like just really encourage you to change how you think through the language that you use, and how powerful that can be, and how that like capitalist systems have really like injected certain ways that we think about profit into our English language, and how that does change it. Like an easy one, of course, that probably many people that listen to this podcast have thought of, is that we say we spend time together. But like, why do we use a word that is like has that profitness to it, like spending, that has a monetary value to it when we're like in community with each other? Like, so yeah, I'm sure, like I said, I'm sure people that listen to this podcast think about that. But I think it goes both ways. Like thinking about new words to help us understand the world, but also changing the way that we use the words we already have.
No, for sure. I will. By the way, I will link all of what we're talking about in the description. Um, you also write in here. I'm quoting you, and I know some people don't like being quoted at. I don't like when they do that, but I'll do it anyway. You write, and I quote: "We're more afraid of losing what we want in the short term than facing dangerous obstacles in the distance. These are failings of culture, not of science." End quote. So, as it happens, so we're recording this like Monday, June 21st. About a week ago, there was a vote in Switzerland on essentially just taxing CO2, like this whole polluter pay principle kind of thing. And I mean, the law had its flaws. I would be among those that says that it didn't actually go far enough, and so on and so forth. but it actually failed. Most people voted not to even have that tax. And I had a conversation with, I won't name any names. The answer that I got, or kind of the impression I got out of that conversation, is just a sense of helplessness, actually. Not necessarily from them, but like I was feeling helpless on their behalf, because it was such a cynical way of seeing things that, like, basically it doesn't make any difference whether we do things now or later. Basically, that was the quote unquote argument. And for me, this is a failure of part of the failure of imagination, because it actually assumes that we will have time later to think about it if we don't think about it now, right? And this is kind of it's a tricky, it's a difficult line to walk on, because at the same time, kind of going back to what you said earlier, I don't want my answer to just say, well, no, later you won't have any time. Like, I don't want that to be my only answer, obviously. Because at this, on two, like, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because on one hand, it is important that we do things now rather than later. Like, we know this for a fact. At the same time, if we don't do something now, that doesn't mean that there's nothing to be done later. And it's a very, very tricky, balance to maintain, because especially the later part of it, you just don't know. And so you can't make that argument like out of certainty, if you see what I mean. So kind of to go back to your quote, what do you think these failures of cultures represent? If that, can you just explain that quote to us, if that's okay?
Yeah. And that's a difficult quote too, because I was reading, I haven't read the introduction to Sunvault in like probably a few years at this point. And I don't know if we would write that now. Like, I'm not sure if we would, mainly not because it's not necessarily like quote unquote like true, but at this point, as more research comes out about what is causing the climate crisis, like on a sort of like a scientific level, like obviously like there's a lot of big ideological issues that are like part of this, but it's very clear that it's not the average person like that's just like living their life. It's not it's not just the average individual. It's this very, very high percentage of billionaires usually, and like these very wealthy people that are responsible, wealthy people and corporations, and also like the global north, like definitely as part of that too, like a large portion of that as well. So in that sense, I feel like particularly white people in the US, speaking from my own position, do have something they need to be thinking about when it comes to this. But at the same time, like, I don't think we can put it on the individual, whether it's like a vote or something like recycling is, of course, the one that a lot of people think about and do. Yeah. And like, yes, you should recycle because it changes your relationship with things and with the living world, and you're thinking about your consumption, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think you should do it because you think you're going to solve the climate crisis. That's not what it's going to do. So yeah, like that's something that we've been thinking a lot about in the new book, because it is easy to write sentences like that, but then also you have to like wrestle with that fact that it's such a small percentage of people that are sort of responsible for the situation we're in right now. In addition to also that sometimes can put using we in that sense, like we're afraid of losing what we want in the short term. That also lumps in a lot of indigenous people that are not responsible at all for what is going on right now, that they were, have been trying to warn us for a very long time. So I think that's something. So yeah, that's just some of my thoughts on like that quote and how we might look at it differently now. But at the same time, I do think it is a failure of culture in the sense that our culture, particularly speaking of like Western culture and a culture in the US, is a culture of individualism. It's a culture of you have to work hard enough to get what you want. And if the other person has less than you, that means they didn't work hard enough. And a sense of like sort of, there's a sense of like there is community, but at the same time, particularly like in like there is also a sense of like certain people there's class, I guess that's what I'm trying to say. There's also a lot of class separation that comes within, like there's community here, but there's also like the class separation is getting so wide in the US that it's like undermining any sense of community. And so yeah, I think that also comes back to that idea that in the culture that's being like put out to us is a very harmful culture and not one that's going to help us with the climate crisis. And we saw this in the pandemic, particularly in the US, where, people refused to wear masks, because they couldn't breathe or whatever. Like, they had these ridiculous reasons for it. And it was an individual choice rather than a community choice. And I think the people that did wear masks and continue to wear masks where it's a place of safety for their neighbors are thinking about that exactly. They're thinking about their neighbors in their community and people that they might not know but come in contact with anyways. So yeah, like we can see how our culture is already actively causing people to die in a very, very open way in the US. And that's the culture that's still being fed and like still being taught and still being put out. So in that sense, I do think it's a cultural failing, but I do hesitate to, referring back to the quote, to see that we as an individual thing, as like we're like you and I are facing this. Like I think that can be a tricky statement and something that we need to be very careful when we're using that language.
No, for sure, for sure. And I hope it didn't also sound like I was necessarily blaming that relative. It's like, I think also specifically from Switzerland. So Switzerland is a pretty specific country. There actually the impacts of heat, like climate change, is, I forgot what the statistics are, but it's happening even faster just due to the geography of the location, and
Oof.
there's just a lot of issues surrounding that. But like, I mean, you mentioned the pandemic. It's just inevitable that we kind of bring it up in some way or another, because I do also wonder, and this is one of those things that I'm saying out loud. I also wonder what I'll think of when I listen to this in like 10 years or whatever. But the changes that it is unfortunately imposing on many of us, a lot of what like a lot of people essentially, it's also driven by like media and politics and so on, just want to go back to normal. And usually there's this go back, there's this emphasis on just let's go back to basically, let's just go back to 2019, pretend in 2020 2021 hasn't happened, and well, hopefully things will be better back then. But for me, this is a failure of the imagination, kind of broadly speaking, right? It's not on any individuals. It's just something that, like, if you kind of taking this eagle-eyed view and you're saying, oh well, something is wrong there. This feels like, well, this seems to be, to me anyway, it seems to be one of the flaws there, right? Like, we are having difficulties thinking, sorry, of different ways of being, right? Again, this whole like easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And this is what I saw in that relative. This is sort of this thing. That's why I didn't blame her personally. I didn't blame them. Actually, it was more people. But I don't blame anyone. I try not to blame as much as I can anyway. But it's just something that I just see it manifested. It starts, or at least the biggest responsibility is definitely at the top with the corporations, all of these things. We know this for a fact by now. But then it's also like, how does this kind of percolate into our own societies, into our own cultures? Because at the end of the day, we live in that same world that's been created by these power structures. And Solarpunk for me has a way, or could have a way, like has that potential, right, to challenge, to undermine this kind of rigidity, this kind of what's the term I'm looking for, like ideological hegemony, if that's not too academic-y. And I do wonder, like, from your viewpoint, if that's okay, like you mentioned the book that will hopefully come out like next year or whatever. How did you sort of go from basically, how do you go from like Solarpunk fiction to Solarpunk nonfiction? Because that's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, no, it's not. And I think one of the part of what we did, it did involve a lot of writing on our part. The book's kind of unique in that sense when it comes to a collection. Usually an academic collection will have maybe one piece by the editors, and then the rest will be by contributors. But we actually included quite a bit that was written by us, because we knew we needed to make that transition, and we knew that transition from fiction to nonfiction would not be easy, and felt like we needed a guiding hand in that sense. So yeah, we did a lot of writing to kind of write us there. And I think what it was recognizing recognizing the possibility in Solarpunk as an ideology, or as a way of seeing the world, doesn't just have to be like fictional, and mainly because the stories, particularly some of the ones that I really enjoy, are happening in like a very near future. There are definitely Solarpunk stories that happen in a farther future. There are ones that are more fantasy based, and those are all very viable and very important. Like there's definitely a lot to learn in those stories as well. But some of the stories that really stick out to me from like Sunvault, like Boston Hearth Project, is a story that I oftentimes point at as a good example of Solarpunk, because it takes technology and it takes the climate crisis, but it focuses in on a community and what a community needs. And so that's where I really see Solarpunk jumping from fiction to nonfiction, is starting to think about the community a person is in and what that community needs, particularly when we start to think about what might happen as the climate crisis continues to worsen. And obviously that's very difficult to try and imagine, but that's where Solarpunk fiction can come into play, is thinking through what might happen to this community that I'm a part of. How can I help prepare myself or have a space prepared, or even just like make sure I know my neighbors. Like that's a big thing that I think we can always make sure and do. And like, what do they have resources that would be helpful? Do I have resources that could help them? Do they have, like, if something were to go bad and we needed to leave, do they have medical issues that maybe we need to be aware of? Or do they have, like, you know, like, how do I make sure every part of the family can like escape or get out or whatever? And I'm thinking, the reason I'm using these words like escape and get out is because I just came from living 3 years in Reno, Nevada, and thinking about the drought there that's currently happening on the West Coast. Like, the wildfire season is going to be really, really bad this year. I don't think there's any way around it. And so sometimes that's literally what you're doing. You're getting your stuff and you're leaving. Like, there's no time. So that's why I'm using sort of these words like escape. So yeah, I think that's one place that Solarpunk can really jump off the page, is that someone who identifies as a Solarpunk or as a writer of Solarpunk fiction can look around at their community and say, what can I do to help this community thrive as things get worse? And also thinking about what the climate crisis might look like in your community. Like, it's going to look very different for me in Williamsport, Pennsylvania than it will for you. And like knowing and learning that what the living world is going through is also part of that too. So it's sort of just having this like trying to find this practical knowledge that many of us don't necessarily have, particularly if we're not living in the place that maybe we grew up in. Or if we lived in a place where we moved around a lot, or there's just a lot of different reasons. But finding that knowledge, finding that community, and then being able to like look forward and say what might happen, like what bad things might happen, and like how do I like work to make sure that doesn't happen. But also too, I just want to add like a quick caveat to that as well. Sometimes too, I think we all need to make sure that we, especially if we're new to a community or maybe are just becoming more active in a community, that we take time to make sure and listen, and to make sure, particularly to people that, to elders in the community, or people, if there are people of color in the community, Indigenous people in the community, like, don't just hop in because you think you have this vision of the future and you have ideas. Sometimes that'll be the right move and sometimes it won't be. And so sometimes just making sure to be like thinking through your actions and being, open-minded, and also making sure to be quiet and listen at times too, I think is also very important to making that transition from fiction, where we can be more lively on the page, to Solarpunk as like a lifestyle and as nonfiction. Just making sure to listen to the other voices that are around, and to not necessarily see Solarpunk as a win-all be-all ideology. Like, that's not what it's supposed to be. That's not what it's going to be. It might be something that's helpful for you and your community, and then like that's what it'll be.
No, for sure. Really, I think it's best to see it as one tool among others, basically.
Exactly.
And I think like something I have tried to like I've tried to be a bit better on this recently, because I was pretty bad at it. Of like I would be very intense about climate change with friends and family. Like, I would just be a super intense person, and most of the time they just block they just block me.
Yeah.
It doesn't achieve the goal that I think it does, essentially. And so one way that I've been experimenting it more recently, obviously like following many other people's experiences, is to start small often. And small doesn't mean inconsequential. It doesn't mean maybe even small is not the correct term. I don't know. But basically it's like I'll tell them, well, get into it, but like pace yourself. Do things, find your own pace, essentially. You will find, like in my experience, like I will go through periods where I'm really doing a lot of it, like there's a huge concentration of it, but then there will be other periods where I just can't, and I need to kind of back off and like do something stupid or watch Netflix or just kind of, anything really. And there is, for me, part of the effort in some ways is to help myself and help others who want let go of the guilt that we have. Now, guilt can be useful if it's kind of a tricky situation. I don't want people
It
to.
is.
I don't want like the exact opposite either. I don't want to just not care essentially, because that's kind of the association that people might have. But one thing that I've learned from reading way too many psychology books for my own good is that worrying essentially can feel like an action in itself, right? Like it can really feel like if you're worrying, you're doing something. If you're not worrying, you're just a monster. And it's more complicated than that, because worrying can actually be a false friend, and it can be just you end up feeling tired, but you haven't done anything really. You just worried about it. You just worried about this thing, and nothing came out of it. Now, nothing has to come out of, like, something doesn't have to come out of it. I'm just saying that it feels like something did come out of it, if that makes sense. And for me, again, like, Solarpunk is a way of kind of hacking that problem in some ways, because we are thinking about the future, short term, even like the present, even, and it's a way of acknowledging reality while also trying to think of how reality could be different. So it's a recognition that we influence reality essentially. So yeah.
Yeah, and I love how you put that. And I think that's one reason why people who sometimes find Solarpunk, they're like, well, this is naive. And it's like, no, it's not naive. Like, I think especially if you start reading Solarpunk fiction, you would definitely see that it's not naive. But at the same time, the whole point is it's not dystopic. Like, I think that's like the thing is, it's not dystopic. And I think whenever people say like, well, why is Solarpunk doesn't seem very punk? Like, what's punk about it? One thing I always say is, well, Solarpunk should be fun. Like, I feel like I always, as is probably very obvious from my answers in this podcast, I have a tendency to lean very earnest and very like serious when I talk about these things, but I always try to come back and interject it with that it's supposed to be fun. And like, you're supposed to be, I mean, there's a reason why people sing songs at protests and chant and dance and things at a protest that might be something for a very horrific thing that's being protested, but you have to have that release. And also it's very important. Like, if we let this climate crisis steal our sense of fun and enjoyment, then like we're looking at a different type of bleak future that we don't want to get in on. So one thing, I was recently talking to some students about writing Solarpunk fiction, and I said, if you haven't been to a punk show, I know many of us haven't been able to do that because of the pandemic, but definitely like go to a punk show at some point, because they are like a ton of fun. But there's also a lot of like emotion that's being released in addition to that very sort of like uplifting energy, whether it's anger or sadness or grief. And I think that's a place that Solarpunk can function. Like you were saying, it can be a place where we can release that. And that's one reason too why in Sunvault we didn't just limit it to near future Solarpunk stories. I think Solarpunk tends to lean a little bit towards the near future, but definitely does not have to. And I think some of that is there's like a lot of fun to be had in imagining space travel and imagining what equitable space travel might look like, and like environmentally friendly and sustainable like the space travel might look like. And so there's a lot of room for just that wild imagination and just the fun that comes from writing science fiction and fantasy to move in Solarpunk as well. So yeah, like definitely like we can't let ourselves get bogged down in total earnestness and total like recognition of how how bad things could be. There's got to be that enjoyment. There's got to be that fun. And I think that's one of the things that also comes from making sure that you're rooting your Solarpunk and your Solarpunk thinking in like community and not individualism. Because as soon as there is once you come together as a community, there's a lot more space for laughter and for fun and for dinners and food to be shared, and the gift giving to happen and things like that. And all of that comes together and comes alive with community in a way it can't necessarily with the individual.
For sure, like one way for me to think about it is like it's the difference between gardening and community gardening, right? And gardening is fantastic. Even if you don't have the option to do community gardening and you're just gardening, that's
Mm-hmm.
fine. Obviously, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. But there is that kind of this added layer that gets added. Like you're also gardening, but you're gardening with others, and the entire point is really that there are different individuals essentially coming together to do this one thing or these many things, and usually almost always someone knows more than someone else. It's almost
Mm-hmm.
impossible to find like as much about radishes as they know about potatoes or whatever. There's always something to be exchanged, and that's actually the process. And for me, gardening is like I understand you mentioned like you don't want too many gardening stories, uh,
Yeah.
and fair enough, obviously. But for me, it is something that the more I see community gardening, garden, sorry, the more I feel like there is some sense of community in that locale, right? Like in that neighborhood. There's one next to where we live, and it's part of the joy of living here, to be honest. I do know that if something happens to that garden, there will be genuine mourning process, essentially, because obviously some are not quote unquote profitable, obviously, and so you have to create a rent creating mechanism, and so you'll destroy those gardens and create some building, and it ends up being an actual loss. I have experiences back in Lebanon. So anyway, yeah. So on that note, so like, are there sort of things that you wanted to get into that we didn't really get into before we can then get into the book section?
No, I think we had a wonderfully wide-ranging conversation, which was good. And I'm glad I did want to make sure to end on sort of a fun note, to put it that way, because I think that is something that we need injected more into thinking about the climate crisis in general. It's just that there has to be humor. There has to be, funny stories that get passed around. There has to be the dancing at protests, in addition to recognizing that, things are going to might be bleak in the next 50 years. And so just making sure to find that balance. Because you even mentioned, if you go too hard on talking about climate change, you usually alienate people, whether it's because whether it's from fear or whether it's because it's hard to wrap our heads around what's going on such a massive scale. But yeah, so just making sure to end on sort of that uplifting note that keep things fun. A punk show doesn't happen with just one person. It happens with a bunch of people, and just see what fun you can come up with in your community that isn't just thinking about how bad things could be. That's not how a Solarpunk story ends.
Well, speaking of stories, or speaking of books, anyway, let's get into the book section. I know them in advance, obviously, so I love all of the three recommendations. But what are the three books that you would recommend, and why?
Yeah, so the first book that I have down is The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, which I'm sure has been recommended before on this podcast. And it's
like 4 or 5 times.
Yeah. Have you read it?
No, not yet.
Yeah, that's how it goes with all books, right? You always have your to be read pile. But yeah, The Dispossessed it's a ambiguous utopia is what it's described as, but don't let the idea of it being a utopia turn you off, because it's so much more than that. But it's about a physicist who lives in an anarchist community, and it's just, I don't know, it's a difficult book to describe for folks that read it. Hopefully you agree with that, but ultimately it's a story of this anarchist community. And one of the things that was so like jaw-dropping for me when I read it is that I did not go into the book thinking I would have any really interest in anarchy. I just thought it was an unrealistic belief system. I hadn't really met any anarchists at that point, and so it was just a different point in my life. And then I read it and I was like, oh my gosh, like this is how we all should be living. Like, this is the way to do it, And so I think one of the things that's beautiful about that book is it makes anarchy look complicated, but it also makes it look doable. Like, it answers a lot of the basic questions that you wouldn't expect a work of fiction to answer, like who picks up the garbage, because no one wants to pick up the garbage, right? So how do we manage that? So it's a combination of a great story, some really great characters, but then world building that is really inspirational. So that's why I recommend it to everyone. It's also pretty short and it's just really good. So yeah, that's the first one. Second book is nonfiction. It's Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. I imagine a lot of people at this point have heard her name tossed around quite a bit. But if you haven't read Emergent Strategy, definitely would recommend it, just because I think it's a different way of looking at the world and a different system of sort of organizing life, livelihood, work, friends that can be really useful. It's not necessarily like, it's not something that's supposed to be like an environmental text, so she definitely talks about the environment a lot. But it's just a really useful book. And of course, there's a lot more works from her at this point. So yeah, I think that's a really good starting point, though. She also, Adrienne Marie Brown, really knows how to have fun while talking about these serious topics, which I think is something that I know I always try to learn from, especially when it comes to her work. And then the final book, I actually referenced one of the essays from it earlier, is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. That's her essay collection. And all the essays are brilliant. I don't think you can read that collection and not be changed by the end of it, which is one reason I really recommend it to people. But especially Learning the Grammar of Animacy is definitely a very important essay. Oh, yep, you got a copy of it. Yeah, yep.
Yeah, I do. Sorry, yeah, continue, sorry.
No, just that's a book that those are three books that I definitely always try to push off on everyone that I meet. I'm like, I think this book will change your life in a good way. So
I recommended Robin's book on the class I mentioned before, so hopefully more people will read it. I actually invited her on the podcast, but she was too busy.
Yeah.
I'll try and re-invite her at some point in the future, and I would hopefully get Adrienne Marie Brown at some point as well.
Yeah, for sure.
I will link to a conversation that she had on the Final Straw, which is this anarchist podcast that I also was on as a guest like some time ago, and it's a fantastic conversation. It was like around her latest book, which is like We Will Not Cancel Us.
Yep.
So yeah, I will. I strongly agree with your recommendations. All right, well, Phoebe, thanks a lot for your time. This has really been fun and productive and amazing, and all the nice words. So yeah, thanks a lot for your time.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Joey. This was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.